Hello and welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Joshua Barnes. Let's first take a look at our top stories. US President Donald Trump has threatened Russia with third-party 100% tariffs if Moscow doesn't agree to a ceasefire deal within 50 days. The president was speaking during a meeting with NATO Chief Mark Rutte at the White House. Well, at that meeting, Trump also confirmed that billions of dollars worth of military support is being sent to Ukraine, including Patriot missile systems. Ukraine has been facing intensified strikes by Russia, with Trump slamming Vladimir Putin. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has set the stage for a political reshuffle, asking First Deputy Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko to lead a new government. Zelensky has asked current PM Denis Shmyhal to take over as Defence Minister. Syrian forces have advanced on Sweden as sectarian clashes continue with government personnel. Meanwhile, Israel says that strikes on the southern Syria area are clear warnings to the Syrian regime. Iran have stated that no new nuclear talks will take place if the US insists that Tehran has to abandon its nuclear enrichment. Months of indirect talks over a potential nuclear deal broke down after the 12-day war, where Israel and then the US targeted Iranian nuclear facilities. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas says that the aid flow into Gaza is improving slightly, but that the situation in the enclave is grave. Dozens of further deaths have been reported in Gaza in the last 24 hours, including 5 people seeking aid, according to local media. The Trump administration has announced a fresh 17% tariff on Mexican tomatoes, which accounts for 2/3 of those consumed in the US. Discussions with the US and trading partners continue ahead of Trump's August 1st deadline. And England have taken a 2-1 series lead after an unlikely final day victory over India at Lord's. The visitors fell just 22 runs short in their pursuit of 193 as England's bowlers delivered on a good bowling wicket. We start this hour with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the United States and German defence chiefs have reaffirmed their commitment to NATO unity during talks in Washington. German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius said a decision on whether to send 2 American-made Patriot missile systems to Ukraine could come within days or weeks. If approved, the first system could be delivered within months. Pistorius, speaking after his meeting with American Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth, confirmed the talks covered missiles and arms aid for Ukraine. He declined to comment on whether offensive weapons were discussed. Let's listen in to the German Defence Minister.
Ich hatte vor einigen Wochen bereits in einem Telefonat mit Pete Hegseth über das Thema gesprochen und ihm im Laufe des Gesprächs den Vorschlag gemacht, Deutschland könnte ja 2 Patriot-Systeme von den Amerikanern kaufen und sie direkt in die Ukraine liefern, schlicht und ergreifend aus der Überlegung heraus, dass wir angesichts unserer Lage im Patriot-Bereich Abgabe, Maintenance und anderes gerade nicht in der Lage sind, ein weiteres System abzugeben, aber bereit sind, angesichts der Notwendigkeit, derer wir uns alle nicht verschließen können, dass die Ukraine mehr Systeme braucht, eben. Machen Sie sich keine Illusionen. Also ein Patriot-System, von dem wir heute sagen, dass es in die Ukraine gehen soll, braucht Monate, bis es ausgeliefert werden kann. Also von daher geht es in der Tat jetzt um Tage, vielleicht Wochen, bis eine Entscheidung fällt, aber dann wird es.
Well, Germany, which has already donated 3 of its own Patriot systems to Kyiv, is considering buying 2 more from the United States as Russia steps up attacks. Pistorius also confirmed that Germany has filed a letter of request to the United States to purchase Typhoon long-range missiles as a temporary solution while Europe develops its own systems. He said the standard foreign military sales procedure would apply. Germany is still awaiting a final decision from Washington on a planned deployment of US long-range missiles to German territory from 2026. Pistorius said the agreement remains valid but is currently under review. While this, of course, coming amidst uncertainty over the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a war that is now into its fourth year. Support for Ukraine has been a point of contention. The United States, under the Biden administration, providing billions of dollars in aid for weapons and other supplies to Kyiv, but Donald Trump wavering on that support at points, pushing, of course, for a Make America Great Again and America First narratives, which have seen the US look at their own stockpiles and question the amount of aid not just going to Ukraine, but across the world. European allies on the sidelines, of course, having their own discussions over defence spending. NATO meetings have led to discussions over how much money will be spent on defence for all of these issues. Well, joining us to discuss this topic is Jim Rice, Professor of International Law, joining us from Vigan in the Philippines. Jim, as always, thank you for being here. We are going to discuss more of that US aid later in the programme, but first I do want to look at the role of European nations, including Germany, of course Boris Pistorius in the United States, to discuss defence as a whole, but also looking with an eye towards Ukraine. How significant and how important is the role of European allies to Ukraine in this ongoing war that is threatening security and geopolitical stability?
It's great to be here with you. It's kind of, if I seem a bit shaken up, we just had an earthquake here about an hour ago, and so it's a little bit distressing. So
we hope you're okay, Jim. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you and your family and all of your loved ones are okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, to try and answer your question, this is an extremely important global issue. And sadly, the support for Ukraine has been politicized under the Trump administration. And obviously, the Zelensky and his government and his people need all of the assistance that they can possibly get in the face of this brutal aggression and slaughter of thousands and thousands of innocent people, both combatants and civilians. And so it seems, well, I'll deal with your questions as they come up, but it seems that Trump now realizes that he's been played by Putin, and so he's reversing course.
Yes, absolutely. Jim, if you stay with us, we're also now joined by Dr. MJ Augustine, a defence expert, joining us from New Delhi. Dr. Augustine, thank you for also joining us on the programme. Talk about Patriot missile systems, significant for Ukraine in their fight against an increase in bombardments from Russia. We've seen records broken in terms of the number of drones and missiles being fired, not just eastern Ukraine, but also the capital Kyiv and western Ukraine, close to the European nations that are aligned with NATO. What's the significance of this Patriot missile system, and why is it so key in Ukraine as it fights off against these aerial assaults?
A good question, Joshua. And let me answer you with one, like you correctly used the word, the brutal example of use of drones by Ukraine in Russia against the strategic bombers. The Patriot missiles will not give you protection from these small-sized drones for three reasons. A, these drones have very low radar cross-section, so it doesn't get picked up by any of the radars. So if you don't see it, you can't prosecute it. And the Patriot missile is essentially a defense system which uses radar energy to home onto its target. So Patriot missile system is designed, the new versions, PAC-3 and beyond, are designed to be used against incoming aeroplanes, large drones like the Predator Global Hawk, and in some cases, ballistic missile. So it forms part of the ballistic missile shield as well, which we have seen in action in Israel. Using it against a low cost or a low radar cross-section drones like Shahid and other ones by Patriot missile system is impossible. What is the defense that is there now in market against these drones? Well, India used a defense system called Joshua D4. The DRDO developed it, and it is a combination of electronic warfare in which you jam the signals of the drones, and secondly, using the directed energy weapon called the laser energy. With that, India was able to thwart close to 90% of the drones which was launched from Pakistan towards India, right from Jammu and Kashmir to the far reaches of Gujarat. And the D4 system is something that we would urge Ukraine to, take a inspiration, leave from it and probably develop it on their own or get it from India. It all depends. So the D4 is the way to go, the general defense philosophy. A Patriot missile system, Joshua, is only for incoming large aeroplanes, incoming large missiles, which has large radar cross-section. Over to you, Joshua.
Yes, absolutely. And Dr. Augustine, if you do stay with us, we are going to now look at that meeting that has taken place overnight, and a sharp policy U-turn has taken place as President Donald Trump announced billions worth of new weapons for Ukraine, this including those Patriot missile systems, amid growing frustration with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Speaking alongside NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Trump said NATO allies would cover the costs of the arms, some of which could reach Ukraine in days. Let's listen in to what President Trump had to say.
Billions of dollars worth of military equipment is going to be purchased from the United States, going to NATO, etc. And that's going to be quickly distributed to the battlefield. I mean, the 500 is, sort of meaningless after a while, because at a certain point it doesn't matter. It's not going to be, 100. 100 is going to serve the same function. But yeah, I have it at 100%. They may have it, I don't know what they're going to end up with. They may have it at 100 too. They may have it at 500.
Well, Trump also issued a 50-day ultimatum to Moscow, agreeing to a peace deal or face 100% tariffs and sweeping secondary sanctions on nations buying Russian exports. Let's once again listen in to the US President.
And one of the reasons that you're here today is to hear that we are very unhappy, I am, with Russia. But we'll discuss that maybe a different day. But we're very, very unhappy with them, and we're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. Tariffs at about 100%. You'd call them secondary tariffs. You know what that means.
Well, lawmakers in the US are pushing for even harsher penalties, including 500% tariffs on countries helping Russia potentially evade restrictions. The move marks a break from Trump's earlier attempts at rapprochement with Moscow, following repeated failed ceasefire talks and continued Russian drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. NATO allies, including Germany, Canada, the United Kingdom and France, have backed Trump's stance, with Germany pledging a decisive role in supporting Ukraine. Let's listen now to Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, who was with Trump in the White House.
Because basically what the President is saying, that he is willing, of course, taking consideration what the US needs itself. So it's not that you can have a shopping list and you can order whatever you want, because the US has to make sure that the US keeps its hand on what the US needs, also to keep the whole world safe, because in the end you are the police agent of the whole world. You're the most powerful nation on earth, the most powerful military on earth. But given that, the US has decided to indeed massively supply Ukraine with what is necessary through NATO. Europeans 100% paying for that. And what we have been...
Well, in response, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed the shift, discussing defence cooperation and arms procurement with Trump's envoy. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
Сьогодні зустріч з генералом Келлогом. Він почав візит в Україну доволі змістовно. Ми говорили продуктивно. Я вдячний президенту Трампу за готовність підтримувати захист життів наших людей. Ця війна, вона триває тільки через Росію, тільки через бажання.
However, EU leaders like Kaja Kallas warn that 50 days is too long given the daily casualties that's being seen. The clock now ticks for Moscow to act before the West imposes its toughest penalties yet. Well, joining us once again to discuss the ramifications of Trump's comments, Jim Rice, of course, a professor of international law, joining us from Vigan in the Philippines. Jim, this situation is a difficult one to discuss because ultimately the rhetoric from Donald Trump has changed on this topic multiple times. We've heard, of course, him praise Putin, but then also bash him in the same week. We've heard of the US pulling back support with key defence for Ukraine, but now it is being reinstated. Firstly, just looking at Trump and his comments, can what he says be believed given the flip-flopping that he has done on this specific topic countless times already?
Well, thanks for that good question. Again, flip-flopping is the word with Trump, but it seems to many people, including myself, that where Putin is concerned, Trump really never comes out in a strong way, either by word or by action. And this latest, this latest threat is to essentially delay for 50 days these some kind of threats of increased sanctions, secondary sanctions, which, if true, would be good. However, there is a Senate resolution that's already in the on the floor and could be signed into law very quickly, but Trump seems to be reluctant to do that. So to me, it's troubling because on the one hand, Trump is taking for himself powers that don't belong to him under the Constitution. And secondly, his kind of, what's the word, prevarication, his delaying tactics, his reluctance to be a decisive leader when decisive leadership is required is, to me, very alarming. And but it's really just indicative of Trump as being an ineffectual leader.
Yes, Jim, let's now look at what was said and take it at face value, because that's all we can do in this situation until we wait to hear if Trump does make any adjustments to what he's committed. Firstly, looking at this support for Ukraine. Billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, also talking about Patriot missile systems going potentially within days towards Ukraine. Is this, as we're seeing it now, a real show of support for Ukraine and a real backing for Volodymyr Zelensky, who's been asking for this for months? Of course, that blow up in the White House in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky is a recent memory, but it seems that the shift has now been made between the US and Ukraine, and that alliance is once again prosperous.
Well, you're right, but really this just shows Trump as being empty in terms of having values of any kind. For him, this is a transactional thing. He's willing to release these defensive weapons to Ukraine on condition that the EU pays for it. So again, it's not impressive. It's not the actions of a great power. It's not the actions of any individual that has integrity or courage. Regrettably, what Trump is doing is he's just revealing to the world that he's got played by Putin, and he's reacting to that because perhaps his ego has been damaged.
Yes, absolutely, Jim. And finally, before we do move on, let's look at these sanctions now. These Russian sanctions that have been threatened. The Senate have been looking at potential 500% secondary sanctions on countries that are buying energy from Russia. Trump saying 100% tariffs, but also setting that deadline. Do you think some politicians in the United States will want that to have gone further, or do you think this is proportionate and fair, given how Trump's rhetoric has been supportive towards Russia?
Well, I fear that Trump will revert to what he's done in the past, which is to essentially delay. He's been threatening to impose sanctions on Putin, on Russia for 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, and 2 weeks after that. And he seems to continue to do this. And obviously, Putin and the rest of the world has figured out that Trump is just bluffing. And so I don't really see that there's anything there, quite frankly. I'll believe it when I see it.
Jim, thank you very much for providing that insight. This, of course, is a topic we will continue to monitor here on NewsX World. And let's stay now with US and Ukraine relations. A significant development has taken place with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announcing a productive meeting with US Special Envoy Keith Kellogg in Kyiv. The discussion focused on bolstering Ukraine's air defense systems, joint military production and sanctions against Russia, as the US continues to strengthen its support for Ukraine amidst the ongoing conflict. The talks also highlighted Ukraine's readiness to purchase American weapons, including air defense systems, which we've said, of course, multiple times, and potential collaboration on joint drone production. On the diplomatic front, Zelensky confirmed that the path to peace remains a central topic in talks with both the US and NATO. The US and Ukraine also discussed the possibility of Ukraine acquiring weapons through European partners, with a focus on enhancing air defence to protect the country's major cities from further Russian attacks. The situation remains tense, with an air raid alert declared in Kyiv shortly after the meeting between Zelensky and Kellogg. As the war continues to escalate, both sides are emphasising military readiness and diplomatic efforts, hoping to find a path to peace while continuing to strengthen Ukrainian defensives. Well, joining us once again is Dr. MJ Augustin, a defence expert, who's joining us in New Delhi. Dr. Augustin, we've covered almost all of what was said there, but I just want to get your opinion now on this US-Ukrainian alliance that we're seeing moving forward. What do you think the catalyst has been? Is it as simple as Trump has spoken with Putin and expected more? Or do you think that this is all part of one of Trump's big plays? He obviously talks about him and the art of the deal. Do you think him trying to play mediator, he's always had Ukraine's best interests, but he was just hoping that niceties and diplomacies might push Russia towards a peace deal, and now potentially he's realised that that could not be the case?
Great question, Joshua. Taking a leaf from what Dr. Jim Rice was saying, two things emerge out of this. A, Trump wants whatever he's going to supply from here on forward to be paid for by NATO. That is a double-edged sword, if you frankly ask me. Why I'm saying this is, if you look at op in Iraqi freedom, op-ed during freedom, and wars after that in Afghanistan and wherever else, wherever US went, its allies followed. They paid for with sweat and blood, with their people, with their equipment, obviously affecting their economy. And they never asked the United States, we are joining you on this fight. Are you going to pay us for it? It wasn't a question. When NATO Article 5 is absolutely clear on this subject. No NATO nations are paying each other when it comes to a collective security provision of NATO. Is as simple as that. So to start with, Joshua, it is a contravention to Article 5. That is point number one. Point number two is a very important point, and that is NATO and maybe the rest of the world in its economic will move away from the dollar-based economy. So it is going to have a larger implication in times to come for US economy, and you mark my words, when people see this kind of arm twisting that is happening just because you're a dollar-based or a dollar, willy-nilly a dollar-dependent economy on certain fronts, those countries now will think twice to trade in dollars. And that means the death knell for a dollar-based economy. For example, petrodollars. I mean, anyone who buys fuel on dollars are actually contributing, indirectly to U.S. economy without U.S. working for it. That kind of situation will arise, and mark my words, will arise in less than probably half a decade. And that is something which, if Trump is, it's a disservice to people of the United States of America when you start arm twisting people like this, saying, I will levy 500%, tariffs and stuff like that. These are things which a statement does not do, without thinking it through over short term, medium term, and long term. I mean, in India, as part of this program, in India, we do, something called net assessment. We assess an action that a country takes in terms of periods, like short, medium, and long. In the short term, maybe Trump will have his way, but in long term, it is going to be, a lose-lose game for him. Over to you, Joshua.
Dr. Augustin, if you do stay with us, we're going to move slightly away from US-Ukraine relations and now look within Ukraine, as their President Volodymyr Zelensky has proposed a major political reshuffle. He's nominated First Deputy Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko to become the new Prime Minister. Sviridenko, an economist with key experience in international negotiations, will focus on strengthening Ukraine's economy and boosting domestic arms production. Zelensky also suggested that current Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal take over as Defence Minister, citing his extensive qualifications. Shmyhal, who served as Prime Minister since 2020, will replace Rustem Umerov, who is expected to be appointed as Ukraine's ambassador to Washington. The reshuffle aims to concentrate resources on defence and post-war recovery. Sviridenko has committed to reducing bureaucracy and protecting businesses, with a focus on making Ukraine one of Europe's strongest economies. These changes are subject to parliamentary approval as Ukraine continues to navigate the ongoing war with Russia. Well, thank you for staying with us, Dr. Augustin. Of course, a big shift up here in the upper echelons of Ukrainian domestic politics, but with ramifications, of course, that could spill out into the war and then the wider geopolitics. What would the shift be for the current Prime Minister to Defence Minister? Given your background, how do you think that shift will take place, and how will that play out given the difference in the roles, and especially during a time of war?
It's a very difficult question to answer. See, how is it going to pan out will completely depend on how the reaction is going to be. Is it going to be, our country is going to pussy-foot, or our country is going to take a tough stance against, what popularly people use loosely the word called taco, the Trump always chickens out and stuff like that. It completely depends how Trump is going to flip-flop or country is going to react, and whether it is going to be a strong reaction, whether it is going to be a pushback, or whether it is going to be a meek submission. And all three are, Joshua, are on the table right now. So it's very difficult to predict how is it going to pan out, Joshua.
Yes, and Dr. Augustin, just the one final question on this matter. I want to wrap up the longer extended discussion we've had on this Russia-Ukraine conflict. Of course, all of these discussions in the US, top political and sort of diplomatic reshuffle within Ukraine is all, of course, with an eye to an ongoing war. What do you think it's going to take for real peace to become a prospect? Is the move from Trump in the right direction, or does much more action need to be taken from Western allies of Ukraine to try and find further talks direct between Russia and Ukraine, and then a potential ceasefire?
Great question, Joshua, and it's an answer which is for anyone very difficult to do. I'll tell you the reason. The territorial integrity of Ukraine is completely in disarray. Every single day, there's a large swath of land Russia is capturing, and it is slowly moving towards Kyiv. At the time of ceasefire, will Russia hand over the land that it captured? Is a very big question mark. My answer is no. What happens then are you going to redraw the map of Ukraine? Very big question mark. I do not think it will happen. What will happen then is those regions now will kind of become a disputed region where people will, live out under the political control of Russia, but in a nation state called Ukraine. It is going to be a very big turmoil situation for times to come if the peace treaty or peace agreement happens as is on the ground. That cannot happen, and Russia is not going to pull back to the territory, to maintain the territorial integrity, or for the sake of viewers, the map of Ukraine. That is not going to happen. Then what are the provisions of peace is something that, everyone is grappling about every single day, even in United Nations, in NATO, and in European Union, with the spoke in the wheel being, which kind of constantly changes position, being Trump and Trump administration. So it is a very, very fluid, and if I may use the word messy situation when it comes to peace, bringing peace to Ukraine. Even if you want peace, can you have peace is a very big question mark. And how are other countries going to pitch in? Very big question mark. United Nations was formed to avoid such situations post Second World War. It completely and utterly failed to do so. It is, it's just toothless organization. So how are we going to tackle this situation? And if we are able to successfully tackle, then it may become a good playbook for tomorrow's wars. And I doubt that it will be a win-win for any side. It is going to be Russia and Russia's word and Russia's stake, with some amount of backing from Trump administration, because at the moment the needle of the Trump administration is tilting more towards Russia than towards NATO. Joshua.
Yes, Dr. MJ Augustin, I'd like to thank you ever so much for joining us. Also, thank you to Jim Rice. We will, of course, be across all of the developments and the counter-developments on the Russia-Ukraine conflicts, looking at those wider implications. But we move away from Europe now and look towards the Middle East. And as per reports, at least 89 people have been killed in southern Syria amid escalating clashes between Bedouin Sunni tribes and the Druze community in the predominantly Druze city of Sweda. This according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The casualties include 46 Druze fighters, 80 Bedouin fighters, 4 civilians and 14 security personnel. The violence has intensified following a series of kidnappings, including the abduction of a Druze merchant on the Sweda-Damascus highway. This is the latest flare-up in a long-running feud between the Bedouin and Druze factions, with a death toll marking the first wave of deadly violence in the region since April and May. In response to the violence, Israel's military has launched airstrikes targeting several tanks in the Sweda province. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz stated that the strikes were a message to the Syrian regime, underscoring Israel's commitment to defending the Druze community, which has significant representation in Syria, Lebanon and Israel, particularly in the Golan Heights. Well, joining us to discuss this developing situation is Jordan Cope, a Middle East affairs expert, who is joining us from Dallas. Jordan, thank you for being here with us today. Let's look at some context on this situation first. Of course, the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad overthrown and the new regime promising no violence, promising an easing of tensions. But can you just provide some context on this flashpoint area within Syria and why fighting is still ongoing?
It's certainly concerning that the former leader of a US recognized terrorist organization that was recently delisted, Ahmad Ashara, who was previously a leader in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, seems to be able to either not be able to control his men and the men who have committed massacres throughout Syria against certain different minority groups, whether those be the Alawites, from which Bashar al-Assad previously represented, and on top of that, the Druze in southern Syria. The Druze comprise about 750,000 people, and following the kidnapping of one of its men, there has been some sectarian violence that has emerged in the south. Now, many of Syria's Druze, as well as many Alawites in the country, fear prospects of future ethnic cleansing, given the fact that Ahmed Ashara's Syria is ultimately now a product of a regime that has now consisted of many members of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a Salafist Sunni terrorist organization that has since rallied support from Bedouins in the south who have since committed attacks and contributed to sectarian violence. The Druze only comprise about 3% of Syria's population, a population of about 750,000 total Druze in the country, and the Alawites comprise approximately 10 million people. And so the balance of the balance of power between the sects under the Assad regime now being gone certainly opens up a vacuum that could threaten different minorities. And even though Ahmad Ashara has feigned to the West a persona of moderation, of a willingness to reform, there are still many valid concerns amongst those minority groups who continue to suffer the repercussions, not to forget the Kurds as well in the north. And so while overall it might be a good thing that Assad is now out of power and that Assad can no longer commit the large-scale massacres that he used to, the minorities in Syria also shouldn't be forgotten. And Israel, Syria's neighboring country, has had to intervene time again to protect the Druze community in the south of Syria, whose leaders at times have actually appealed for Israeli help.
Yes, Jordan, looking at wider regional instability, do you think it's helpful for Israel to be getting involved with strikes, given the conflict that we've seen in the region, or in your opinion, is it really important that Israel do get involved to protect these minority communities living within Syria that potentially face threats?
I think it's certainly important for Israel, if it deems so important, to intervene to protect the Druze community and others from potential ethnic cleansing in the south of Syria. The Druze population also extends into Israel, and there's a sense of kinship between the Druze community in Israel's north and in the northeast, as well as with the Druze in Syria. And even though political tensions have separated families over the years, with the very hostile borders between the countries and the fact that Israel and Syria haven't normalized unto today, Israel definitely feels probably more of a responsibility now more than ever in the instability that is Syria to protect the Druze when its central government will no longer protect them. It is obviously a very complicated situation, and Israeli-Syrian relations are rather interesting. These days, it's rumored that normalization prospects could be greater than ever, despite Israel's interventions in southern Syria. It seems that Syrian officials, such as even as high as Ahmed Ashara, have recently met with figures as high in Israel's political sphere as Tzachi Hanegbi, the head of Israel's National Security Council. And furthermore, Israeli and Syrian officials will be meeting this upcoming weekend in Baku, Azerbaijan. So prospects of normalization are very real right now. It's to no coincidence that the United States recently removed sanctions from Syria. And on top of that, even went as far to undesignate Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as a terrorist group, which is a very bold move. And so there's a lot of moving pieces right now in the Middle East, but Israel and the Druze people are rightfully concerned about some of Ahmed Ashara's forces who have been killing and arresting members of the Druze community. and not just doing it in an already uncivilized manner, but making this a clear national and religious struggle, chanting Allahu Akbar, claiming that these lands are Arab lands, and making clear that they're not Druze lands, and making the Druze population probably feel very unwelcome, even though they are belonging generally to a type of Islam, one that is considered heretical by many Sunni Muslims throughout modern-day Syria.
Yes, Jordan, thank you ever so much for providing that context and insight. You will stay with us as we remain in the region, but move now to Iran, which has ruled out any new nuclear talks with the United States if they are conditioned on halting uranium enrichment. The statement came from Ali Velayati, a top advisor to Iran's supreme leader, amid renewed diplomatic efforts following last month's brief but intense conflict with Israel. Tehran insists it will not give up its right to peaceful nuclear activity. Previous US-Iran nuclear talks mediated by Oman broke down after 5 rounds when Israel launched a surprise strike on Iranian facilities in June, later backed by limited US military action. Since then, both sides have expressed interest in reviving talks, but no meeting between Iran's Abbas, Araghchi and US envoy Steve Witkoff has been scheduled, that according to Iran's foreign ministry. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian reiterated Tehran's support for diplomacy, saying the country remains committed to peaceful negotiations. Despite Western accusations that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons, Tehran continues to deny it, maintaining that its enrichment program, now reaching 60% purity, according to some experts, is solely for civilian purposes. The IAEA also states there's no clear sign of weaponization. Well, joining us once again, and thank you for staying with us, is Jordan Cope, of course, Middle East affairs experts. Jordan, this situation is obviously a difficult one following the 12-day war, following the tensions and rhetoric. Firstly, looking at this uranium enrichment, why is the West so keen on getting Iran to the table to discuss a nuclear deal at this moment?
The reasons are clear. It's simply to prevent a greater war from breaking out. The West obviously doesn't want to have to fight any wars that it does not have to. However, as we've learned with Iran over the years, it is not a good faith actor when it comes to its nuclear program. One must not forget that Iran was a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it violated in escalating its uranium enrichment levels to those as high as they were. One must also not forget that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which the United States left several years ago, even though the United States left that agreement, there were still other countries to whom Iran had binding obligations to not enrich, and yet Iran still enriched. It violated international law in multiple ways, and on top of that, it ultimately was found to be in breach of a non-proliferation condition with the IAEA, which passed a resolution against Iran upon finding out that Iran ultimately had conducted nuclear implosion tests and had enriched to levels as high as 60%, and also had undeclared sites where there were uranium residues found. So it's very clear that Iran in recent weeks, even during the negotiation stages with the 2 weeks the 60 days before the US decided ultimately before Israel attacked and then later on the United States, it's clear that Iran, time and time again, has been using every good faith opportunity that the West has given it to enrich its uranium stockpiles to a level well beyond what is needed for a civilian nuclear energy program. Simply put, for a nuclear energy program, one simply needs uranium that is enriched to approximately 3 to 3.67%. The fact that Iran has enriched it to approximately 60% is simply unexcusable. It's clear what their intent is. And as Dmitry Medvedev has noted recently, what's now out in the clear is that Iran ultimately did have a nuclear program designed for weapons, and it can continue to try to produce them.
Yes, Jordan, I do want to look at the final comment I made in my read section there. The IAEA stating that there was no clear sign of weaponization. do you think that the trigger was pulled too early while diplomacy was still ongoing when Israel decided to launch their large-scale attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities? Do you think that stopped any possibility of diplomacy? And of course, that will now have an impact on Iran's willingness to engage in conversations, because they say they were already doing so, and that was taken out of their hands when their military and nuclear facilities were attacked on such a large scale.
If I properly recall, the IAEA ultimately passed a resolution against Iran, and that was passed simply a day or 2 days before Israel ultimately attacked. That resolution was designed to ultimately raise awareness to the breach and violations in regards to its nuclear enrichment of its non-nuclear enrichment obligations. To pretend that Iran has been diplomatic throughout this whole process is simply, in my opinion, a flawed way of looking at this, because Iran, throughout the past many decades now, has been sponsoring proxy groups to do its dirty work throughout the Middle East. It's been funding terrorist groups, whether it be Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether it be the Houthis in Yemen, whether it be Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. What Iran has ultimately done is it has outsourced its bad faith duties to other terrorist groups to ultimately sabotage peace deals throughout the Middle East, to ultimately handcuff countries and their economies, to cause them to stumble, to allow Iran to progress towards a nuclear weapon without interference from some of the more powerful countries throughout the Middle East, such as Israel, which has had its hands tied now for years to deal with the Iranian threat head on.
Yes, and Jordan, finally, as we bring an end to this discussion, I of course want to look at the bigger picture as we look towards potential discussions. That's how we opened this section. Iran saying that there need to be certain sticking points that they are looking at, including a continued uranium enrichment program. Is this all coming about because Donald Trump took the decision to pull the United States out of that agreement of 2015? And what responsibility do you think that the US have as a result, given that this deal, as we know, took years to come together? It took contributions from the EU, Russia, China, the UK, France, the US, Iran, many nations coming together to get this deal done. It's not realistic, surely, to think that a deal was going to get done with Steve Witkoff, who ultimately isn't a diplomat, in a 60-day period. Is this a blunder from the United States? And do you think that more time needs to be given to make sure that this deal is lasting and can actually be productive in stopping potential nuclear weapons, something that Western leaders have all been in unity over?
You mentioned, it's a good question you ask, and you mentioned something very important, which is there are many countries also part and parcel of the JCPOA agreement that were not the United States. And according to international law, Iran owed all those other countries a duty not to enrich. The JCPOA non-nuclear, the JCPOA nuclear deal was binding upon Iran to all those other countries not to enrich, not to progress towards a nuclear weapon, which it did. In addition to that, the fact that Iran has been progressing towards a nuclear weapon even well before Trump ultimately removed the United States from the JCPOA was a clear indicator Iran was acting in bad faith, as well as the fact that Iran ultimately progressed towards a nuclear weapon, at least in terms of developing its infrastructure, well after Iran also had signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Time and time again, it has violated agreements. It has violated agreements that it still owes to other countries throughout the world. And it's to no coincidence that as early as tomorrow, possibly, we might see several European countries, including the US, the UK, Germany, and France, applying to have those snapback sanctions reapplied to Iran. So we will see what happens, but it seems to be becoming clearer to other Western countries and not just the United States that Iran clearly is not acting in good faith. And additionally, I'd just like to add that Iran has added another condition to engaging in negotiations, which is a pledge from the United States that it will not attack in the future. And that simply is a condition Iran knows that the United States will not agree with, because if Iran ultimately does advance towards a nuclear weapon once again, the United States will have no other option but to attack a regime that has funded millions upon millions, even billions of dollars to terrorist orgs and has committed to the destruction of one of the Middle East's only democracies.
Jordan, thank you ever so much for your detailed insight there. We will, of course, bring you all the developments on discussions over Iran's nuclear programme. We do stay in the Middle East now, though, and European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas has said that while there are encouraging signs of increased humanitarian aid reaching Gaza, the EU expects more concrete progress on the ground. Her comments came ahead of a high-level meeting in Brussels with senior EU and Middle Eastern officials to assess the humanitarian situation in the war-torn enclave. Kallas acknowledging that some aid trucks and supplies are now entering Gaza more consistently following a recent agreement between the EU and Israel aimed at easing humanitarian access. The agreement includes provisions for opening more crossings points and facilitating aid routes. We see some good signs of more trucks getting in, more supplies to the people of Gaza. Kallas told that to reporters. But of course, we know this is not enough. We need to push more so that the implementation of what we have agreed also happens on the ground. That again from Kaja Kallas. The EU has been pressing Israel to allow more sustained and unhindered aid deliveries into Gaza, where the humanitarian crisis has worsened due to the ongoing conflict, displacement and limited access to essential goods and services. Kallas emphasised that the EU will continue working with all regional partners to ensure that commitments are made and are upheld in principle, but also visibly impacting conditions for the civilians living in Gaza. Well, joining us to discuss these statements and the ongoing situation in the Gaza enclave is Shruti Dasgupta, an international affairs expert who joins us live from New Delhi. Shruti, as always, thank you for being here. Some clear comments coming out of the EU. Kaja Kallas saying that while improvements have been made, the situation is still grave and still needs to be improved. How significant is this intervention from a top EU leader, given that there has been, of course, a conflict in world leaders and Western leaders over the situation in Gaza amidst the Israel-Hamas war?
Greetings, Joshua. Thank you for inviting me. For me, it feels as if the EU has always been in support of Gaza aid, and they have this current aid discussion via Kallas has been something that is absolutely against what Spain and Germany, they've been very vocal about it. They do not want this association. And there will be, I think, a few days from now, going to be a talk of Israel's breach of faith with the EU with regards to their ongoing conflict in Gaza. So this is a thing that is unfolding. In terms of aid itself, the EU has felt that, okay, this was very much required, that a third person, apart from US and Israel-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, provides aid to the Gazans, that 2 million Gazans that are suffering from insufficient fuel, insufficient food, water and supply. So all of this is absolutely necessary. But in addition to that, the statement that she made was that they need to be sure that the aid does not percolate down to Hamas. And that is something which, how they will do it is not clear as yet. Those particular conditions have not been discussed. Beyond that, they have also agreed to kind of have EU border assistance mission for the Rafah crossing point. So they've kind of they've talked about redeployment of the EU border assistance at the crossing point of Rafah. They've not yet spoken about which points where they will be exactly these aid distribution points. And they also want to be very clear that they should not be confused by the Palestinians to be the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So they want a distinct identity for themselves. They do not want this aid to flow via the routes of Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. They want their own aid points, while they want to make sure that there is no aid diversion happening to Hamas. So the situation for EU is like walking on a very tight rope. They want aid to come through, but they don't want Israel to have any direct, access to the funds or the aid itself, and they do not want Hamas also to have this. So it's a very tightrope walk, and I hope they do make it so that a large swath of humanity gets access to the required food and other necessities for basic life.
Yes, absolutely. And Shruti, as we bring our discussion towards an end, of course, so much talk around diplomacy, so much talk around politics and the GHF and other potential aid routes. But ultimately, there are millions of people here that are potentially facing a humanitarian crisis which is unimaginable. How important is it that these aid disputes and the different routes are set up in a way that is safe and won't see civilian casualties like has been reported? Hundreds of deaths, the UN say, have taken place around aid sites in Gaza since the end of the short-lived ceasefire deal. How important is it that while diplomacy stalls on the sidelines and conversations around a ceasefire continue to drag on, that the situation for the people living in Gaza, many millions who have already been displaced, how important is it that it's set up and it's right and it's acting in a way that is helping the people?
So while the aid is important, we have to understand that the entire scenario in Gaza is very, very muddy. It is covered in fog of war. We cannot distinguish Gazans from Hamas, because Hamas, when we look at them via pictures and reports, they're wearing that black garb and that green headband and with guns in their hands, but they don't really walk around Gaza like that. Recently, I think it has been reported that they killed 3 more Israeli IDF soldiers, and they've called it the war of attrition. So that basically means that Hamas is still very active. They are very much capable of countering Israel and its forces. The only difference is that the Gazan forces, the Hamas is no longer in uniform. So you cannot differentiate between a normal Gazan and Hamas. So right now for Israel, all of Gaza is Hamas, and they cannot differentiate. And this is the reason why when the lines are slow moving, when there is suspicious movement, when there is somebody that distinctly looks familiar to a known face of Hamas, they try and engage with them, and that leads to a loss of life and casualty. And the aid line seems to be the only way to draw out Hamas into the open. So this is how it's like a mousetrap set up. But unfortunately, in this mousetrap, a lot of civilian life loss happens. And there seems to be no way out. Gazans seem to be incapable to throwing Hamas out of from within their own. Because whenever they've tried, Hamas has gone ahead and shot the very people who have tried to encourage a revolution where Gazans disengage from Hamas and their identity. So Gazans are stuck between this ugly political push and pull between Israel wanting the Hamas out and using Gazans as their political currency, and Hamas is using Gazans as their political currency, not just with Israel, but with the world, so that aid and fuel and all the other facilities come through. So right now, with the EU, the discussions that have gone through, I think since March, this is the first time fuel trucks have gone inside Gaza, and a little bit of the fuel shortage might be mitigated by it. I believe part of the EU deal with Israel is that they will allow power supply to water supply mechanisms. They will allow it to hospitals so that basic necessity is met, water supply resumes, medical emergencies are attended to. So these are a few conditions that EU has tried to push forth. As the largest trade partner with Israel, they have this currency that they're using very well to ensure that Israel does what is right by humanity. But on the other side of this, when Hamas calls it a war of attrition, that means they're in it for the long haul. They've dug in their heels, and they're prepared to take whatever life loss in the form of Gazan civilians. They are not looking for peace.
Yes, Shruti, sorry to have to cut you off. We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you ever so much for joining us. As always, we will bring you all of the updates from the ongoing humanitarian situation in Gaza, as well as the diplomacy and fighting between Israel and Hamas. But that is all that we have time for. We'll continue to bring you that and much more from across the world.